Hey folks, I'm Larry Kiger. I'm a senior industry specialist focusing on security and compliance with AWS. And today we're going to be talking about securing student data in the age of virtual learning. We're going to have a pretty full agenda, but I'm going to try to touch on all of those areas and what those are, kind of like what is student data. You guys already know what student data is, but I'm going to talk a little bit like who's responsible, those 7 fundamental principles of best practices, if you will, for privacy. Some of the industry challenges that are being faced right now in the educational fields, designing it, getting started, kind of like who that is, design, show me. I'm going to give you a very quick synopsis or a demo, if you will, on how to do these things, and then how others are doing it in the industry. So really quick, some things that you already know. What is student data? It's personally identifiable information. It's things like enrollment information or academic information or possibly parents or students' information. And these are things that we have sworn to protect as educators. So let's focus on shared responsibility because you can't go through a security discussion without having some sort of touch on the shared responsibility model. And so let's focus on that for a second. What is your responsibility? Your responsibility as a customer is things that you put into the cloud. That's essentially it. And then the things of the cloud, we are responsible for. So all the infrastructure and underlying services, you're responsible for the data and all of the things that you put in. Very simple. So what are those 7 fundamental privacy by design areas, right? And I'm not going to touch on a bunch of these, but I want to talk to you about a little bit. Proactive, not reactive, and preventative, right? So how do you do that? What are those areas that you can do? So things like proactive, that means building or assuming that you're building something that will lose the data potentially. So knowing what that data is and how to handle that data is really key and really fundamental to being able to understand where you're going to go in your student privacy design areas, right? And making sure that that data is really protected. What about things like full end-to-end security, right? That's a big piece. So when we talk about full end-to-end security, we talk about making sure that your security starts at where you ingress or where you put your data in, how the data actually gets there, and where it actually egresses. So when we talk about egress and ingress, you're like, wait a minute, what is this? I'm not talking about network architecture, but you are, because it really starts with the fundamentals. It starts with your infrastructure. So we talk about that. We talk about designing it from how it gets there to how it comes in, to how it's stored, and all of these areas that kind of meet in the middle to really make a good practice of privacy. And then what about respect for users' privacy? What does that really mean, Larry? And I think you have to ask yourself that, but then you need to really think back. We're a customer focused, AWS is. So as you being educators, you are often customer focused as well, because who are your customers? They're the students, and the data that you're trying to protect is those students' data. So respect for others' privacy means that you are treating their records just like you would treat your own, and that's really important. So a little bit of a funny haha, but I think one of the things that we have to ask ourselves, and you guys have seen this, and I've talked to a lot of teachers. I have family that are teachers, and they all say, I'm not a technologist, right? So I wrote this, Jim, I'm a teacher, I'm not a technologist. And I think you really have to know that, right? And one of the things that I thought was really funny, back in the 80s, you remember where they used to have this thing that came on in New York, and it was like, oh, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your data is? Well, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your kids are? But I kind of said, it's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your student data is? So you really have to ask yourself, do I know where my student data is? So let's talk about that a little bit, right? So what are some of those issues? Let's get back to what we were going to talk about. So what are those issues, right? You're being asked to do more with less money. So how do I really get student data protected when I don't have time? I got so much to do and I have no money to actually do it. Well, I'm going to show you some ways that are really simple. right? What about, getting more systems in play? So now I've got students, I've got teachers, and I can't protect all that. Everybody has their own PCs and they're all connecting to my network. That's another problem, right? You're expanding the horizon of what you typically would see as a security. And you would see, and so now you've grown in your responsibilities to try to secure all of these different machines coming in from different places. That leads us to like more devices, more problems, right? What about the higher demand? It's now that COVID's hit, I've got all these other students that are kind of really just clamoring to get education. But how do I do that? How do I meet that higher demand? My network's not big enough. I'm having all these different problems. Jimmy down the street is hogging up all the bandwidth on my line. Maybe that doesn't happen to you, but sometimes it does to me. I live out in the country. So let's talk a little bit about how do you start? How do you get finished with some of those areas, right? You have to control that current state. You have to understand what is going on with your data. So you have to discover what type of data you have out there. So you have to really do some discovery. Then you have to assess where are those controls and what controls can I actually bring forth? And by controls, we're talking about things like security controls and maybe compliance controls and governance controls. And what about implementing? So how do we implement that? How do we mitigate some of those things that we find? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about that and kind of give you kinds of a heads up really as to how you can do it as we go forward. So how do I discover student data? Well, the first thing is just kind of determining what those boundaries are, right? Remember I talked about the ingress and egress. So we're really working towards like, what is that ingress? How do I actually make that happen? Where is the data going once it gets in? And then how am I protecting that data? And then what data is going out? Well, I don't know. That's what this step is for. So we have to determine what the boundaries are. Then we got to create data flows. And for those of us that are not software engineers, right, or security people like me, the thing that we talk about in terms of creating data flows is how that data goes in from point A to point B to its storage, through the storage to some other tool, and then how is it accessed? Who is accessing it? And how do I find that student data? That's the big question, right? And so we have a few things. We have AWS Perspective, organizations to control who has access to your data, and things like AWS Control Tower and Amazon Macie, which I'm going to show you Macie, by the way. So what's the next step? How do I assess it against best practice? So we first need to think, how do I do that? What do I need to bring in place? So I think we have to first start with a good, well-layered security. And I'm talking about, when we talk about layered security, it's thinking from, like I said, starting with that ingress, how is the data getting in, and protecting that data with things like, with IDSs and IPSs and other Amazon tools that we can actually bring into that, and then controlling it through, am I actually going through TLS, for instance, right? Or that transport layer security. Where am I going with this? Well, it means I'm encrypted, or I encrypt that data from the very first time that the data comes in to the cloud to where it sits. We call that data in motion and data at rest, right? So that's really making sure that that layered security is there. Am I scanning for vulnerabilities in my databases? Am I patching? Am I doing all that stuff? All of that falls in under the layers, right? And you can think of those if you look at like maybe an OSI model, right? Where you talk about, I have network and I have transport layers, and I've got this, layer 7 application layer, way too technical, right? But think about it in terms of going from, I have data, like I'm getting into a car, I have that getting in, and then I'm starting the car and I'm going somewhere. That's a good way to look at security. I'm just trying to get from point A to point B, but I need to understand all the steps in between before I go to there. So what about scanning for data that I already have? I call that repository scanning. So if I have some storage like an S3, right? Simple, I have an S3, and how am I going to store that? Where's it going? How am I getting there? I'm getting in the data and I'm storing it somewhere, and maybe it's in my my simple storage service in S3, or maybe it's sitting out somewhere else, right? So, but we still need to know where that data is, and we need to scan for that data. And then we need to put some governance practices in there. How do I maintain that? What needs to be secured? What doesn't need to be secured? How am I checking up on that? What are my KPIs, key performance indicators, that show that I'm there? And what are my KRIs, my key risk indicators? What do those look like? How am I supposed to get that data there? Well, that's for your organization to discover. You have to set those. You have to understand exactly where that is. And to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, you have to know where your student data is. The 10 o'clock, do you know where your student data is? That comes into play very, very strong when you get into that, right? So how do I secure? How do I get this done? Well, we set some security design principles for you already. And that's what this slide is. And that's why the little stop man's up there, he's basically telling you to stop. You have to consider where your security is. Now, security is not privacy. And we all know that security is not privacy. But security makes privacy kind of work behind the scenes. And privacy controls or drives what security needs to be. So how do we actually do that? Well, we start with these. Implementing strong identity foundation, right? Who can access my data? Enabling traceability. Do I have audit controls to say who did it? After the fact, right? Who's accessing this? Oh, Larry, why are you accessing student data? You're my security guy. Why do you need access into it? That's a good question, right? You have to ask that question. But then you have to really set those governances that say, Larry can access that. And we start doing that by that strong identity, right? So what about, we talked a little bit about applying security at all layers. I'm going to show you a slide that kind of goes through some of those layers. But then how do we, what's the big picture, the big takeaway that I'm trying to tell you? Automate, automate, automate. Automate your security best practices. So why do it 100 times when you can only do it once, when you only need to do it once, and you can actually go back and sit back and let some of that stuff happen from an automation perspective. I'll show you a little bit about that too. Trying to lead you up into this. So what is protect data in transit at rest, right? So how do I actually do that? Well, it's TLS. That's things like encrypting your data. That's making sure that things that are moving in and out, that ingress and egress, are already encrypted. It's protecting that. And then, keeping people away from the data. What does that really mean? How can I keep people away from the data? Do I need to access that data? No, it's in the database. Why do I need to access it? Let's put some automated API calls in there. Something that actually brings it up in there and so it allows me to essentially take that data and do something with it, right? So why are we constantly letting people in our data? Well, just bad practices. So back up, take a step back and say, who needs to implement the data? Go back to step one if that's what's happening. And then is there any other ways that we can access this data without having people put their hands on the data? And it's not to say that people are distrustful. It is to say more along the lines that people are people. We're humans and we all make mistakes. And so therefore, you have to really take a look at a step to say, do I really need people touching that data? And then the last thing that I really want to touch on is preparing for the security events. This is things like practicing your incident response. You already know that something's going to happen, but you have to ask yourself in the preparedness portion of that, which also ties into those 7 principles. Am I ready? Can I be ready for something that happens? And then if a data were to be lost, well, you have to practice that. You have to create your run books. You have to do all the things that you're responsible for to ensure that your security is the best that it possibly can be. So let's go through the demo really fast. So really what I'm showing you is that this is what we would consider student data, right? We talked a little bit about it. What is student data? So this is student data. Essentially, we have a username, some child. This kid is withdrawing from the school. Well, what kind of data is out there that could be sensitive to that student? His birthday, first and last name. Maybe it's got his mother's name on there, father's name, phone numbers, social security numbers, possibly. So that's what we're doing. So now you can see, hey, we're actually going to put this in or simulate putting this in to an S3 bucket. This is going to be unstructured data. That's exactly what you're seeing here. So There's the bucket. Let's talk about that. So we're waiting to see. Okay, so there you can see that the student record is actually inputted in. So now, what's going to happen? That's the surprise. You're going to see in a second, I'm going to get an email. And I did that through SNS. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the architecture is. Boom, there's that email. So we required some action. Some objective has actually happened. So we had a Macy finding. We talked about that. We're saying, hey, how can you do that, right? What do I know? So this is discovery. So now what are we going to do with that finding? So we know that Macy has a finding. So now what? So we want to do something in terms of automating that. Let's see if we can do that. So there's the student record. And there's where it's contained in the S3. And that it was uploaded. Just kind of showing you a little bit of that background data. And then who's the owner? Ah, there's Abhi. He's a bad, bad man. He's uploading stuff without really thinking about where it needs to go. Is it wrong, really? Not really. But we have this happen all the time, right? We have people come in, they just drop it into an S3 bucket. They assume this is the bucket I need to drop it into, but that's not really what it should be, right? So this is simulating unstructured data. So what happened? Some automated thing happened. And I want to talk a little bit about what that automated piece was. So there it is. So something happened when the student data was detected, and it fired off a step function in Lambda. And Lambda is our serverless infrastructure, right? And you can do things like automate in Lambda. So as we're going through this a little bit, I want you to start thinking, where did that actually go? Where's that student record there? So it got stuck in there, and it's open, right? But we want to do something with that. We want to encrypt that. We want to move that into a bucket that really can't have anything. So here, we've done some classification on this. So we did an information classification, which told us that it's PII. Where does that come from? That's a tag. But it's also a finding that happens within Macy, okay? So here you can see what the Macy finding is and why it was actually moved. So how did we do it? So here's all of the secret sauce underneath it. So essentially, we said we created a new S3, and we did an invocation, from Macy. So Lambda did an invocation that said when something exists that has or contains PII, do something with it. Move it to an encrypted bucket, lock it, keep it away, do all those wonderful things, right? That's exactly what this is doing. So I'm going to show you a little bit underneath the hood. Just give it a second. So just kind of showing you a little bit about what's going on in terms of how that Macy finding was discovered. And I promise you folks, it's not that much longer. So there's the Macy remediation state. And then there is the secret sauce underneath it. So essentially, we said on start, or once it gets loaded, right? If it's found with PII, then quarantine it and then notify the admins, right? Hey, somebody stuck something in there that was potentially PII. What do I actually want to do with that? And so I think that that's really key in this area, right? So I don't have time to look at the hundreds of records that come in every day. Maybe that's so. Or maybe I just want to make sure as a secondary check that things are being done in the background to ensure automatically that I'm not sticking PII in an unencrypted bucket, right? Just good security practice. So here you can start seeing a little bit how that actually works. And if this was a 400 level class, we could really get down and dig deep into exactly how to write that script. And I think that that's something valuable for you to learn. And I'd be glad to have a discussion with you after the class if that's something that you're curious about in terms of like, how do I script that? What type of step functions am I actually building? So how does that actually look like? So here you can see kind of a user doing an input or doing something into that simple Amazon Simple Storage Service. And then AWS Lambda is handling it from there. In terms of a step function, it's going and it's calling Macie to look at that document or to look at that spreadsheet or to look at that PowerPoint or whatever else that you're putting in there. And Macie is going in and doing its inspection to see what it has in there based on a predefined algorithm that we set up in terms of this is PII, right? And then it's taking it and saying, I have a CloudWatch event because I found PII. And it's sending it into Amazon Simple Notification Service or Amazon SNS, which then is going to generate an email. Now, you don't have to generate an email. It can be a text message. It can be just whatever you want to do, right? It can be a Slack or even Teams if you really want. So we talked about implementing a little bit earlier on. We talked about what is that best in class, security controls and where does it all fit. And if we take a look at this from a basic NIST CSF, right? We see those main things: identity and access management. How do we handle it? Well, these are the tools that you can do. Things like adding Amazon or AWS single sign-on, right? AWS single sign-on, what does that really mean? Well, it means I only have to sign on one time. It carries through. It can use AD, it can use, SAML or whatever else that you have. So what about detection, right? How do I detect if something is happening? Well, we talk about Security Hub, Amazon Guard Duty. We used a little bit of those tool sets in the presentation that I showed just a few minutes ago, that demo. What about infrastructure protection? We have AWS Firewall Manager, Shield, which is a DDoS protection. We have WAF, which is a layer 7 web application firewall. Amazon Macie, which I showed you, which is really cool, goes out, inspects that data, tells you whether or not PII exists. And then, you have some incident response things. AWS config. And AWS config rules really kind of setting that compliance or that governance model to extend out and to be able to right size itself when something happens. That's really a cool feature. So I reached out to a few of our clients and I wanted to know what their story was. And one of the folks that really stood out was an organization called D2L, or Desire to Learn. And they're a big tech company up in Canada. They're an ed tech company in Canada. And one of the things that they did was they wanted to find a way to detect and remediate AWS misconfigurations across all regions in D2L's 255 plus accounts. So how do they do that? Well, they used AWS config in conjunction with AWS Security Hub, which managed and customized insight to third-party tickets. That's a lot for you to handle, but through automation, that's really where you're going to get the biggest benefit. So that's what they're doing here. So, and really, what is some of the benefits that they got from that? Accurate and automated solutions from detection and ownership, assignment to the remediation. And that really kind of set the path for them. So what did some of the folks say? So D2L really believes that learning is foundational upon which they all can progress. And that's where their achievements actually rest. So working closely with the organization and globally, D2L has transformed the way that millions of people learn online and in the classroom. So who's another example? Athabasca University, another Canadian university. I was really into some of these stories as I was listening to them. So one of the things that we saw was, as a part of their all-in migration to the cloud, Athabasca, or AU, really was looking to modernize their security approach. So what did they do? So they customized logging to include Amazon's SQS, Amazon's SNS, simple notification service, to help out in automating with their incident response. So I talk a lot about, with my clients, a lot about like automating what incident response is and how it actually functions within the organization. And we showed you an event that happened or could have been an incident inside of your organization if that data were to get out. And so having something that's automated to go back and to notify you, such as the SNS that you saw, an email sending you from Macy saying, hey, look, there's PII that just got uploaded and it wasn't really protected. Take a step back, take a look what that is. So Athabasca actually used some of the tools and processes that I showed you in the demo to really kind of drive home what their needs were in terms of incident response and tying it all together inside a Security Hub, really giving them that overall ability to stand out and to look at kind of an overall function of what security is within the cloud. So really the things that we want to take away from that is that they really did a modern-based approach to cybersecurity. Why? It's automated. And they did it for very little money. And I think that that's really what needs to be said, is that for very little money you can automate and you can actually drive down your footprint in terms of protecting your data and your students. And that I really have to give them to Athabasca. So before you go, a couple of things that I really want you to take away from this, right? Start with the fundamentals. Start understanding exactly what it is that you need to try to protect. What is the data? So if you need to, draw that out. Understand what it is. Go from point A to point B. Try to figure out exactly how the data is moving. What type of data is it? Who needs to access it? And then always consider the AWS security best designs or designs principles, right? Before you start, do things like end-to-end security. What are the tools that I can bring to bear? And making sure that you have that layered defense. So then, what about things like quick starts? I didn't even talk about those. But you can do things with quick starts. You can do privacy by design with quick starts. You can go out and look at things like HIPAA. You can look at other architectures, ISO, and you can take those and you can build them and then add to them. That's the benefit of quick starts. And then I think the last thing I really want to leave you with is to save time and effort with automation. Don't redo everything that you have over and over again. Try to avoid that pain from an analyst's perspective of having to do that. So automate, notify, make sure that the right people are brought in at the right time. I really hope that you learned something and got something out of this. As usual, you can always reach out to me and to my other colleagues and talk a little bit more about this privacy and talk a little bit more about security. And I'm there and here to help you with any of your security needs. So please take the time to complete the survey, the session survey at the end. I don't get better unless I get the feedback from you guys. Thank you. Bye.